I'm here to talk about a little kind of a carryover from what Brennan got to announce today about the MS-130s, and really about how we're using that platform as a way to extend policy and better finer grained policy, especially across switching wireless, so they get a full stack kind of perspective. And so, real quick agenda, obviously, I'm going to introduce the session here, but going to go through kind of how we're expanding adaptive policy support, looking at kind of ways to carve out policy in a way that you can kind of expand over time. You don't have to take care of everything in one single project. Get through a little bit of the telemetry bits, and then hopefully have a bunch of questions in the middle. So you may have heard me talk about this before. As Tom mentioned, I have spoke at Tech Field Day before and maybe had the same topic in different capacities. But for those of you that haven't seen any of my presentations or any of the content on adaptive policy, adaptive policy is Meraki's kind of implementation of Cisco's TrustSec solution using inline security group tags, which means that we can share context over the data plane. So if you have never seen TrustSec or don't understand some of these terms, I will describe them a little bit further, but it allows us to associate a grouping to every packet coming from a device, which means that we can start providing policy. And we can do so in a topology agnostic kind of manner. So we don't care about the IP addresses. It's really about associating a group to a client and then be able to act on that. So it means you don't have to rip and replace your network to gain benefits. You don't have to re-architect the IP topology. You don't have to do crazy things with different security functions like PVLANs and proxy ARP and all that good stuff. But security group tags, in our case, is an added header. It's the CMD header. So if you look at a packet capture, there's a new layer in there. And this allows us, as I said, to attach that grouping to every packet coming from a user. And we share these over the data plane between infrastructure devices so that we are able to provide like a micro-segmentation kind of outcome. And since we've introduced the 130 X and R models, we are expanding support for adaptive policy down to these compact switches. It's not going to be at launch, so if you get your hands on a switch somewhere, you won't have it immediately, but we are looking at getting this out the door, hopefully in our next software release, which is coming anytime now, hopefully. But not only are we able to support things from like a compact and ruggedized perspective, all the way up to that 9300 model that Brennan was going into detail about. And that means, though, that we've finally rounded out the portfolio to the point that we're able to provide, from access to edge. So instead of having to have a hybrid environment for your fiber aggregation to be able to carry SGTs, we can do so with that 9300X, the 12 and 24Y, as well as the 24S and 48S models. But we don't just have support in our switching portfolio. We recently added support in the MX and Z platform so that we have the ability to, in the first release for 18.1, propagate SGTs, preserve them over auto VPN so that we can have policy expand beyond a single site. 18.2, we start adding in a bit more functionality like VPN concentrator support so that you can have big head-end VPN concentrators and still carry that context. And 19 and on, we're going to be adding more and more functionality, really rounding out the enforcement portion and making sure that if you have a teleworker appliance, you can do full policy enforcement and control. And just because I can't leave out wireless, we've had wireless since we launched the solution. And with wireless, we do full enforcement, full propagation. I've had people ask so many times, so the APs don't do anything, right? The switch does. Yeah, no, the APs are 100% part of the topology, part of the enforcement, and do the full classification and micro-segmentation. And the reason this is so important, and the thing that really makes it interesting to me, is I came from post-sales where I used to do all sorts of security deployments. I'd put firewalls in, we'd look at role-based access, and we would come up with so many different ways to apply policy or to associate traffic to a specific user or group. And usually it was painful. It involves integrating with Active Directory. And there's usually a delay before you get a user and its actual grouping. And it just is just not a fun time. And so with using SGTs, we're able to actually share that context over the data plane, so it doesn't take any extra latency. We're able to, with the packet, see that it's from a specific group, which we can then apply policy. So in this case, you can see we have a wireless client. And instead of having like the access point have a control plane connection to the, the MX in this case saying, hey, here's all my clients, here's the different groups they're part of, we can just derive that right out of the data plane and have it be very, very quick. And as policy changes or as like a user's group changes, maybe you've got a radius server, that will all update along with the data plane, so you don't have to worry about like syncing mechanisms. We built this feature at the organization level. So if you're familiar with Meraki dashboard, we have organization, we have networks, and most features are built in the network. We look at it as like, building out SVIs, building out, switch port configs. We built this at the org level, especially for policy, so that you don't have to build policies and update them on every single network as you go. So if you deploy adaptive policy and you need to make an update to block IoT devices from communicating, it is just a couple clicks, and then it gets pushed down to all the sites where the feature is enabled. It is a config update, so it does take a minute or two, but that's about it. There's no dynamic like syncing that has to happen between the network devices and dashboard to have the policy downloaded. It is just there as part of the configuration. Now, if we look at defining policies, a lot of times people try to like make a project with a start and end date. And policies usually, especially security, is an ongoing kind of thing you have to manage. You usually can't just stop with like, okay, we're done, move on. I've seen companies try to do that. I've been on projects where that was like, they're like, okay, so by this date, we're good to go, right? Like, no, you need someone to be like working on this like pretty consistently to keep it up to date. But a lot of times, we don't think about like chunking it off and making it something that we can like start working on in small spaces, or like in this case, like a retail location, and then expand the scope of that policy defined. And so, like I kind of drew this up as a kind of a mock-up of a fairly standard like kind of smattering of devices in a retail store. We've got like digital signage. As Brennan was talking about the 130R, you think like sandwich boards, outside ordering menus, like those kinds of use cases. We can take care of those. And now with expanding adaptive policy, we can start covering like a lot of these unique use cases without having to have hybrid deployments out there. But we have point of sale, very common, cameras, because theft prevention is pretty typical. And then sometimes on-prem services like an NBR or IoT controller, because we like to add IP connectivity to everything nowadays. And in this case, we can, if we really just look at this store, we could look at a scope to just being, how do I protect these devices from, but that means that we probably want to try to look into, just a very on-off type policy. Like, okay, we know for a fact that cameras probably shouldn't talk to other cameras, probably shouldn't talk to point of sale servers or point of sale endpoints. And in adaptive policy, like literally all you have to do is go in and define your permits and deny statements, and do so. You can do so in bulk. So like you could select camera and then like the 10 other groups you don't want them to talk to, and then just click deny. And this allows us to start, kind of looking at this as least privilege, or that zero trust kind of mentality where we try to block everything and only permit what's necessary. And what this means is that if we have a camera that attempts to communicate with like a point of sale, desktop, maybe it's a tablet, in an adaptive policy environment, we're going to see that packet come in, typical packet structure. When it gets to the switch, we have the ability to classify that endpoint. And like in this case, I'm using a very basic scenario of like a port SGT map, but we would classify that endpoint with an SGT of 10. And when, it was much faster this time. And then once that traffic comes in, the way that this works is we'll look up in the table and see if we know the destination group tag. So in this case, this switch does not have this point of sale device directly connected. And so it doesn't know that DGT. So it will forward that traffic on with the CMD header containing the group information. And it'll forward that on to the access point. And at this point, the access point is going to see, okay, this is coming from a source group tag of 10. But we can derive that destination group tag, because that client is directly connected to the access point, is 20. Do a policy lookup. And when we do that policy lookup, deny and drop the traffic. Now, one thing I did note here is that we don't just drop the traffic, we can produce log events. So if you turn on logging, we can tell you, hey, this device traffic was dropped, source IP, dest IP, group information, as well as like the number of hits on that. And we'll also increment the hit counters. So we have a tool that we're getting ready to launch that lets you device by device look at hit counters to see if there's been policy enforced. It's quite fun. But if we look at that store and we think about, okay, if that policy works at this store, how do I expand it beyond just a single site? And since this is IP agnostic, we can usually rubber stamp that and take it and just put it on each and every site. And as long as we classify the endpoints, we get the same policy outcome. When we built adaptive policy with the MX in mind, one of the things that we wanted to do was make sure we could do a phased approach to deployment. Most customers can't turn something on everywhere immediately. Like, it takes some planning, some thought. And so when you turn on adaptive policy, it's just a couple steps, but you can selectively enable it on a site-by-site basis. And then we will, whether if the site's capable, we will send encapsulated traffic. If it's not, we'll strip that header off and then just allow for the network to keep operating.
So you mentioned, I think, a really good point in that customers can't necessarily always just turn on enforcement. They may not be ready for it. So we've been talking at length about secure group tags.
Mm-hmm.
And if a customer isn't ready to enforce security group tags throughout their environment, does Meraki support some of the legacy enforcement methods like downloadable access control lists or just changing VLANs, that kind of thing? Is that available?
Yeah. So depending on the switch model, we are going to be bringing like what we call group policy ACL to like the 100 series, which is, I like to think of it as like kind of in between like a named ACL and a DACL, because of the fact that like you define your group policies in one place and then they get pushed down to all the switches. And then it becomes just a filter ID that you send back. So you could do like a standard ACL for enforcement. We support VLAN, like changing VLANs and all that. And usually in security, you'll use a combination of a lot of those things.
Yeah.
Like you could use an SGT for everything if you really wanted, but usually you do security in layers. And so we would still, probably have an ACL that's also attached to an endpoint. That's a good question, though. And that's something we've been working on rounding out, is like our support of just standard fundamental, security functions.
A follow-up question. So you mentioned that you turn it on at the organization level and then you can deploy it to selected sites when you go to actually push it out. Do you also have the ability to essentially tag it into a template so that it will auto go out once you know that it works the way that you want it to? So I in the past life experience, I supported organizations that had lots of sites being deployed regularly in Meraki. And so they don't want to necessarily turn it on for the thousands of locations they're currently running, but once they have it locked and loaded, they would love to not have to go back and retouch the hundreds of things that they're planning to be deploying in the future.
Yeah.
Is that a thing that is possible?
So we don't have support in templates, and there's a few reasons why. We've got a lot of work to do to kind of make those a little bit more flexible. We do support most of this through, well, all of it through the API, though. And there are some really neat projects, including one of Brennan and my coworkers wrote this really neat Python script that takes a network, and then you tell it what aspects of the config in that network you want to clone, and then you just run a script, you tag all the networks, destination networks, and it just goes and dumps it all in. Works really well. It's kind of like just a config orchestration tool, but not in templates yet. But yeah, I would say API would be a really good way to make sure you do it quickly and easily, without error, hopefully. But yeah, back to this real quick. I mean, we tried to make sure as well that propagation and preservation over VPN isn't hard. I've seen so many different implementations of VPNs. I've built so many of them. I think AutoVPN is probably the easiest VPN solution I've ever worked with. And carrying SGTs isn't much more difficult. In fact, all you have to do is go to the VPN settings page, enable propagation or pure SGT capable. All this is saying is that the MX itself is capable of sending and receiving SGTs, and it sets a flag in the AutoVPN topology that says, hey, any traffic destined, keep that header intact and send it over. The other piece to it, and the second piece of the puzzle, is obviously we're probably going to have a downstream switch or access point, and so just making sure you also propagate that SGT down to the AP, and you're done. And as long as the two sites are configured, you've got yourself, full propagation support over VPN. And when we enable propagation over VPN, we're able to expand the scope of policy. And if you start defining a policy that works well, expanding that scope out means that we're able to have the same level of control that we would over a device that's like connected off the same switch, let alone across the entire organization. And if we had a similar scenario to the previous one where we have like a camera that's potentially compromised trying to talk to another device in the topology, the nice thing is that it's kind of the same exact process. So when you look at troubleshooting, when you look at like trying to figure out how things work, we're still going to go in and we're still going to classify the endpoint with an SGT. I'll get into a couple different methods of doing so. But once we classify that traffic, we will do the same SGT DGT lookup. So we're going to look at local switch. Do we know the destination? Do we know any of that information? And when we don't, instead of like trying to drop traffic ingress, we're going to keep forwarding that traffic on. And we're going to, as in the previous situation, we're going to encapsulate that packet with that CMD header and SGT. And then we're going to send it over AutoVPN. I'm going to try to see if I can advance these slides fast enough that this will like update along with my talk track here. And the nice thing is that when it gets to the point of VPN, all we're doing is keeping that header in place in that IPsec encryption. And there we go. And send it on. Once it makes its way to the other side of the site, once again, we're going to keep doing those DGT lookups. And until we have that destination group tag, we're going to continue forwarding that traffic. And this actually means that we can scale to a significant number of endpoints because each network device only has to care about the directly connected endpoints. And so when you look at like a security policy where we have like, let's just say we were using like SXP everywhere. Like if you're familiar with SXP, it syncs IP to SGT maps between each and every device that's set to peer. You end up with a very, very large list of things that get stored in usually very valuable space on a switch. It's in TCAM. And when we use the data plane and we use enforcement at egress, we end up being able to like kind of reduce that scope size for each device down to just the connected endpoints. And that means that you can have, like we have customers that have over like 3 million devices connected that have SGTs or have had SGTs associated, and they didn't have to buy a like massive switch just due to the way that architecture is distributed. So anyway, this switch would drop this traffic, and after it does a policy lookup, just the same as it did before.
Can you step through how customers would handle the integration between Meraki and traditional Catalyst environments? So how you have these policies set up in Meraki and then conversations or traffic that then have to traverse into environments of Catalyst iOS XE environments where that policy is built within ICE or within Catalyst Center.
Yes. So I actually have an entire section on that. I can talk through like at a high level, like it's pretty straightforward. All you have to do is make sure that you build the SGT propagation. So in dashboard, you would set pure SGT capable on the link to the rest of the network. On the other side of the, whether it's Catalyst switch and FTD appliance, you would just make sure you have the same, just trust and propagate. And then from there, it's just going to carry that same data. We built it actually, this entire solution around the goal of having it be very easy to integrate, whether it's a standard TrustSec environment, a couple of the other implementations. So when this next slide loads, one of the things I wanted to bring up is that we're not just limited to permit deny. Yes, that can be very easy, especially as you're starting to build a policy. You could just have a bunch of permits between groups, denies between groups, and you've already done quite a bit when it comes to limiting your area of exposure, especially with regard to like security issues. However, we do have this concept of a custom policy, which means that we can take and associate what we call custom ACLs, which is like, if you're familiar with TrustSec, is a security group ACL. And you can limit things down to specific like ports. So we could say, hey, we only want to allow an employee talking to this web server on port 80 and 443. We don't want them to try to SSH to the server, whatever it may be. And within that, we also have a couple of things that we are adding in. I mentioned that we have that logging that's getting added. There's also TCP established matching. So that one's kind of fun because of the fact that what it does is allows us to have policy built in one direction and then just match TCP established on the way back. So instead of having to define a mirrored policy in ingress and egress, or it makes it a little bit quicker. So you could go in and just set permit TCP established. You can match port information, so you can really limit it down. Like the second example here is a common one where we need a desktop admin to be able to help someone out in the field that is having issues with their machine. And instead of having to build a substantially long list of things in the inverse, we can just match that established flag along with any other data we need. And we have a number of different ways to assign SGTs to endpoints. There's from switching, we have port to SGT. We have IP subnet to SGT maps if you have anything outside of scope. We're also adding in VLAN to SGT. So these are all VLAN and subnet to SGT maps I like to look at as a kind of a catch-all. So if you don't have a port to SGT map, a radius server that's sending back an SGT, we can still fall back and classify endpoints based on how they're connected and the segments they're in. If we look at a data center environment, not all data centers can carry SGTs, but we can still get the context necessary onto a server instance or a specific host instance by doing an IP to SGT map. In Dashboard, this is an org level thing as well. Use a policy object, attach it to an SGT, and then that gets pushed down to all of the, in this case, MS390, 9300s. And then if any traffic ingresses the switch coming from that host, we will associate it to that SGT and be able to apply the same level of policy that we would have if it was directly connected.
So continuing the data center conversation, ICE has an integration into ACI to be able to create SGT to endpoint group mappings. Does Meraki have a similar integration?
We would use ICE.
You would use ICE. It'd go through ICE. Okay.
Yeah. Thankfully. It's a complex one, but yes, we would use ICE. And
okay.
Here in a second, I'm going to get into what we did add with ICE, which is, and I'll just start talking about it, and hopefully these will load here in a second.
Question for you, if you want.
Yeah.
Wait for that to load. So as I'm not super familiar with the Meraki platform, in this depth.
Okay.
However, I'm very familiar with the Catalyst platform at this depth. So as we're walking through this, I'm hearing a lot of what I've heard before with DNA Center and SD Access. So is this essentially what we're building up here? Is kind of like the Meraki version of SD Access, at least on the security side?
Yeah. So the one thing that SD Access is broken down into is there's the VRF or VN piece, and then there's the SGT portion.
Right.
And we are absolutely we're more or less building out the most user-friendly TrustSec experience versus an SD Access experience.
Okay.
That's not the I think the big differentiator from my perspective is we're not doing VXLAN tunneling. We're not doing the fabric piece in the sense of a VXLAN fabric, but in a way it is its own fabric. It's just a
And that's kind of like ACI. It's there's the fabric bit and then there's the security bit.
Mm-hmm.
And same for SD Access. There's the fabric bit and the security bit. So this is
absolutely
more the security bit for Meraki. That's I know it's being broad and probably simplistic at a couple of spots, but that would be a good summary.
Yeah. It is our we're leveraging the same type of components, so we're using SGTs in both cases. And in fact, you can actually even have SGTs brought into an SD Access fabric from adaptive policy. All you have to do is just propagate through, in the border or at an edge. But since it uses that common component, it's the same kind of security outcome.
Okay.
And that was a lot of why we wanted to go with this versus some bespoke thing we built through Dashboard, was giving that same kind of policy experience, right? So being able to have someone go to the headquarters, get an SGT, gets the same policy outcome if they went to a branch.
So then you just said policies there. All right. So are the policies portable? So if I had a policy, I'm already doing SD Access and I've got policies built out there. Can those be brought over into?
Yes, sir. Yes. So that's actually why I skipped the previous slide to directly to this one, because I think this hopefully will help answer the one thing we did work on with the ICE team for quite a while is building out utilization of our APIs so that ICE could publish policy updates and policies to dashboard. And so if you have ICE integrated with DNAC, pushing policy for SD access, it can also push policy to dashboard. And that means that if you have a dedicated security team, they don't have to be in dashboard. They don't have to be associated with anything involving like the NMS management of whatever it may be. They just update ICE, hit the sync button, or they just let it wait for, I think you can set the interval for 5 minutes to 30 minutes, and it will always just sit there and just sync and validate policies updated. So there's more to come with this. Like we're going to do some continuous like work with the ICE team on adding more functionality. But this gets us that SGT, gets us the ACLs, gets us the policies defined, and sync between the two environments. And so, yeah, TrustSec, SD access, if you had an ACI integration, it allows for us to be able to kind of use it as the common like orchestration tool, I guess.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. If you don't have ICE, we do support just sending an SGT through the standard AV pair. It is weird that we chose a hex value for something that's usually human like configured. So you will go in, unless you can convert hex to decimal and vice versa, you will have to use one of those calculators and convert things. I did that just so I could figure out that was 4,000. But other than that, if you send back an SGT value, God forbid you use like NPS or something for radius, it will work. We will take that SGT in. Now, speaking to the radius conversation, because I like radius quite a bit, I've been working on this with a number of folks within Meraki, and it's taking like things that we constantly configure and trying to put them at the organization level. So radius is so painful if you have to configure it 1,000 times because you have, let's say you have 1,000 networks. And you might even do it more than that, like 8,000 times, because we make you configure it on SSIDs, on access policies, on MX ports, and you have to configure the same server, same shared secret, same ports over and over. And sometimes I would imagine you probably have like muscle memory at the end of it. But instead of that, we are bringing the radius server configuration to the org level so that you can define your radius servers, up to 100 of them, and then you go to a network and you just select which one you want to use. I've wanted this for so long, and it is super dead simple. It's literally just defining them, going to like, we're starting with access policies. It's going to be brought to the rest of the portfolio, hopefully here not too long. But yeah, you just put a little checkbox next to it, click save, you're done. And it'll populate both auth and accounting. So you don't have to select one for each, because that's another pain point that I loathe. So anyway, yeah, this is a lot of fun. It's going to be, I think, launched in early access here soon, which if you're familiar with Meraki's early access program, you can go into dashboard, organization, early access, and enable things that we don't necessarily want to turn up everywhere, but let you try it out. It's kind of like the old beta, like feature testing. You used to have to like reach out to an SE. I think SEs hated it. I did when I was one. I used to, oh God, not again. And so just let you do it yourself. And you can turn it off if it didn't work the way you wanted. Yep.
A question there. So you have it applied networks, which would, when you spin up additional networks, is there the option to just have it be all of them, or is this templatable, or can I just, I'm going back to the, hey, I'm deploying new sites. I don't want to have to go back and touch this in order to have it apply to those new sites.
Yeah. So once again, API. Yeah. Now that doesn't mean that we're not going to have a way of like, we're going to build more things in this manner. I'm working on like how we could do access policies, for instance, so that you define your radius config and then you just reuse it, and you reuse the whole policy config. And that's something we're working on. We're working on a few other features like port profiles and such that we want to bring at the org level to reduce the amount of like just repetitious config. But yeah,
a lot of organizations, especially on Meraki, as you all are very well aware, so not to tell you your own business segment, but like have hundreds or thousands of sites that are literally cookie cutter exactly the same. Mm-hmm. So there's really, only 4 device configs, even though there are hundreds or thousands of locations. I mean, to the cable plan is exactly the same. So going through it and doing anything multiple times additionally for new networks doesn't really make any sense.
No, I get that completely. We are working on like a lot of these things to try to make that like life a little easier. we do have templates today that you could build out your policies and all that in. This is more so towards the, I can't use templates because of X. And so we want to make it so, like, easy to still have that, org level config. We are going to build out after, well, here's soonish, grouping of those servers. So you can do a primary, secondary, tertiary, and then just select the group that you want to use. So just reducing another set of clicks that you'd have to do. That'll come, I think, hopefully here in the next quarter or so, after we get this out the door. The last thing I wanted to end with on this portion was that one of the things we tried to do is make sure that when you're deploying like adaptive policy, that you have it's very flexible in how you apply that classification, because not every network is the same, not every environment's the same. A lot of customers don't have radius, and you don't have to have radius to deploy this solution. There are many different methods, like just SSID assignment. We are bringing group policy, like SGT assignment. So if you're familiar with wireless and group policies and like IPSK without radius, you can have a PSK associated to a group, and that group can have more or less access to the network. And we're also going to be adding that SGT so that you can then carry through the micro-segmentation bits without having to do a complex radius deployment if you don't need it. Now, most security policies are not like real policies unless you can validate them. You're just guessing and hoping. Usually you won't have a job much after that. But one of the first things, and I mentioned this a little bit ago, but we are bringing hit counters, and that's going to be across our MS and our wireless portfolio, so that you can start validating that there are policies being enacted against traffic. This is a high level. Like if you think about troubleshooting, you usually start super high level, work your way down into the more granular details. And so this gives you just a good snapshot of, okay, so I do have some traffic getting dropped. And if you're wondering what that traffic is where we start getting into the actual logging function. And when that comes up, the one key piece of the logging function is it gives us a full view into the the IP info, port, and number of hits on traffic. There it is. And we're bringing this to the as an event log, but also as a syslog message. So if you have like a SIM that you're using, or you want to aggregate some statistics on, you can go in and see all that data. And this allows us to get further down into the weeds of like what's happening. A lot of times you'd enable logging on even on permit statements if you've got like things you want to monitor, like if there's endpoints communicating that maybe you want to validate the kind of traffic they're using, you could log just on a permit. A lot of times logging on denies those, so that you can start seeing clients that are like scanning the network, attempting to do things they shouldn't, and then kind of pinpoint them. But if we went even further and you were looking to get more data out of the network, we do have NetFlow support across our MX and our MS 390 and 9300 in Meraki mode. And it is fairly comprehensive. And this means that you can start exporting quite a bit of data off of, from an MX perspective, exporting, as traffic typically goes to the internet and back, but get east-west data out of the switching portfolio. And we're not just capturing a 5-tuple flow. It's actually rather comprehensive. The recording config is my screen is very lengthy when we pipe it out. And we capture a number of things, like the NBAR data, so like the application information. We also have ETA support, so that we are capturing the crypto information without having to do man-in-the-middle decryption. And then also including the SGT, so that we can start building cool things like integrations with secure network analytics, where we are able to run reports and show traffic usage between groups and allow you to kind of build policy with data. And I think one of the things that I always found fun in the field is working with customers, trying to help them identify what type of policy they could deploy that's not going to break everything. And we used to do a lot of interviews. I don't know if you've ever had the privilege, or whatever you want to call it, to interview people and ask them what they do, and they have no idea. And it turns out the person at the front desk actually has database access because they're inputting things that I don't even know what this is. And so when you build a policy, a lot of times you're just kind of going based on people's ability to explain what they do. And not a lot of people can do that. And that means that like I built a policy with one customer where they were like, we want to block everything and only permit the stuff that these people need. And I'm like, wow, to start? Can we get there later? Like, no. So we were building these like downloadable ACLs that were ridiculously long. And we blocked so much stuff that we shouldn't have. And it's because we didn't have like a lot of the data to back up like what was going on in the network. And so in integrating with like secure network analytics, for instance, or other flow analyzers, you can start gathering information around like what actual flows are there, what data, what things do we need to like leave in place and allow for communication so the business doesn't cease operation. And with secure network analytics, though, they do have this TrustSec report, and it's awesome because you can see things at a group level versus like an IP level. So instead of saying, okay, this IP address talk to this IP address, you can actually see the group information, you can see where they're coming from, and if you have policies put in place and you have it synced with ICE, for instance, it's able to pull in like if it thinks there's escaped flows is a term where traffic may have made it through even though you have a policy in place, and just allows you that comprehensive view of what's going on as well as the data to back policy decisions and creation decisions. The other piece that's really neat with secure network analytics is that we can also, when integrated with ICE, we can kind of do like a self-driving network in a way. And what I mean by that is, if you've ever worked with security environments and you've had someone say, okay, we got to have somebody on call, so if there's a blah, blah, blah event, here's the process to go through to stop that endpoint from communicating or to stop that user from what they're doing. If you build policies out in secure network analytics, you can actually trigger like policy changes automatically, and it's called adaptive network control. And it works 100% great with like the adaptive policy deployment that we have. The really cool part is when it works, when you get to see it actually happening, it's kind of baffling because like you'll watch the flows come in. I build this really fun one where I make fun of Canada. I just do that because Brennan's always somewhere in the area. But I'll do like geo rules and I'll block or quarantine an endpoint when they communicate with Canada and they're coming from like an employee security group tag. You can do just about anything. Obviously, like Canadians, that's why I hang out with them. But like you can really limit things down to whatever it is that's within policy or within requirements. So if like someone's data dumping, even if it's east-west traffic, like quarantining those devices before they potentially steal incredibly valuable information. We are building some more visualization of data. So here soon we're going to come out with the adaptive policy matrix and like telemetry visibility. So when I say telemetry visibility, we're not just showing you like the policy that's in place. That part's going to be great because I think most of us are familiar with looking at a matrix and knowing like cell intersections and the policies that are there. But we're also going to highlight and kind of aggregate data across all the network devices. So when I mentioned hit counters are like typically a device by device thing. You'd run a live tool, get the output. Okay, like there's stuff happening. And so in this case, we're building this at the org level. Once again, because since we perform policy at egress, you may be troubleshooting across networks in some cases where you have a client connected in branch A and they're communicating with a resource in some other place. And instead of making you go back and forth between networks to try to capture information, you just come here, you can filter down to the specific networks that you want to look at or devices within those networks. And then we're going to aggregate the data, any of the logging, so any of the like logged events that you've created from a policy perspective, and allow you to kind of filter down on that information. We're not just bringing all those like logs together, which like this part's kind of fun because like if we capture, I forgot to mention this, if we capture like the logging data, one of the things we're going to be doing is also populating the permits and denied packet counters with like the specific applications that were denied or permitted. But one of the other key pieces is we're going to have kind of a policy change filter that you can put in. What that means is if I make a policy change between groups, and when this next slide loads, it's going to make a lot of sense. When I make that policy change, one of the things usually you want to do is validate that it's working. And so here it is. So we're going to show you within like the 30-day window, if you've made any policy changes, what you changed it from and to, as well as displaying like and filtering down to when that policy change was made, and then a specific time window. I'm not sure how much time we're going to like do before and after. I think we're probably going to look at like a few hours. just so that you can see like, hey, I made this policy change and I just saw my counters go up or down depending on what that change was. And so just another way of like trying to help make sure that when you're making changes, when you're updating things, that you can validate that what you did was what you wanted to do. The one key piece to this that I wanted to like kind of bring home is that we built this solution as a way for us to kind of have a foundation for zero trust in Meraki. And this is a full stack thing. Like, we didn't build this just for wireless, just for switching. We built this in a way that so that we could bring, full stack security, so that when you deploy Meraki, you get like the best in class like control over your endpoints. But if you don't just have Meraki, we also used, as I was mentioning earlier, the appropriate solutions to allow for integrations across Cisco. So if you have, firepower appliances, TrustSec environments, you have a hybrid network where you have, 9500 in your core that we don't manage. It'll all interoperate, and we built it that way so that it's as flexible as can be, but also as powerful as we can, kind of get out of especially switch hardware, where we're limited based on ASICs, which is like when Brennan mentioned it's only on the X and R models, is because we put specific ASICs that can handle that encapsulation.
So if I go back to my earlier analogy, just like talking about the Catalyst version of putting in the SGTs and everything in the Meraki, what we're seeing here, how close to feature parity are they right now in terms of maybe not in the design, but the enforcement, all of the knobs that you can turn on? Like, if I've already designed that and I'm happy with the way that that's working inside of SD access, and is it can just come straight over into Meraki, or am I going to lose a little bit in there?
I think it depends. Like, there's a few things that we don't have. If you look at like deployment scenarios, like we don't have SXP support. A lot of that because of scaling. Like, we haven't gone down that path yet because we want to make sure this scales really well and we don't end up with like overwhelmed platforms. Policy-wise, though, for the most part, it's fairly comprehensive, especially with us bringing like things like the established matching and a couple other key things. There is a little bit more that you can do, like you can have more SGTs in like a dynamic like TrustSec environment or SD access environment because of the way that policy is updated on an endpoint. So if you had 1,000 SGTs and you've got a TrustSec deployed or SD access deployed, the switch will query like the radius server, or ICE in this case, for the policy and the information as that endpoint connects. We're doing it all pushed as a config update, so we have a little bit of scaling limitations there. So it's really like number of groups. Right now we support 60. It's not like a hard limit, right? It's kind of, we set 60 and we're waiting for like a lot of examples of customers that need like hundreds. But you get to hundreds and you've got kind of chaos. Like, it's a lot of group. And we found that a lot of customers out in the field that have deployed TrustSec at like scale, they have a lot of them under 40 tags that they use, because they use this as a way of like a high level grouping for control over, just east-west traffic. Okay. And so, yeah, a lot of it's like just scaling for the most part. Like, policy-wise, enforcement-wise is nearly identical. And they will interoperate, like MR attached to a fabric edge and SD access interoperates just the same as a switch would attached, and just because of the core functions that we have. So,
okay. So having SGT enforcement is great. If you don't want traffic flows to happen, it stops them. And you brought up earlier in how that can be logged and you can track what SGTs tried to communicate with other SGTs. Do you see any customers taking that a step further and leveraging? Are there any integrations that they can leverage to take to other Cisco products or maybe other partner products to say, have policy to say, I know I don't have this SGT allowed to talk to the other one, but I want to inform another security solution if it does try, because it may indicate that there's something going on or potential compromise in the environment?
Yeah, so I think like one of the key ones that I would say is probably the most compelling is the secure network analytics, the StealthWatch.
Okay.
It used to be called StealthWatch. I have a hard time with the name changing.
No, I'm glad you brought it up. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known what you were talking about.
Yeah. So let's just say, for all intents and purposes, StealthWatch. Like, with that, I mean, if we send that flow data and it's integrated with ICE, we also get the policy information, and so you can build event alerting and like not only can it consume that data, but you could have it pipe out to like a ServiceNow or something if you needed to.
Okay.
We do have the syslog function. So when you enable logging, it'll send a syslog packet off. So you could also collect it in like a Splunk or in a whatever tool set you have, and then use that as a another mechanism for consumption. And also APIs. So it's an event log, so you can use the API.